June 13, 1942, 12:37 a.m., Amagansett Beach, Long Island, a lone Coast Guardsman walks through thick fog, unarmed, 21 years old, just a flashlight in his hand. Then, 4 shadows emerge from the darkness. They claim to be fishermen, but their clothes are bone dry. Their accents, wrong. Their eyes, dangerous. Within seconds, one of them shoves $260 into his palm. Forget what you saw. This kid has no weapon, no backup, just seconds to decide. Take the bribe and walk away or risk everything. To understand what this young, unarmed guy did, watch until the end. It will be interesting. The fog that night was the kind that swallows sound. John Cullen had walked this beach 100 times before, his boots crunching on wet sand, his government-issue flashlight cutting weak yellow circles through the dark. Standard patrol. 4 miles of empty coastline. Nothing ever happened here. Regulations said he shouldn't carry a weapon. Too young, they said, not enough training. So he walked alone, unarmed, scanning for debris, fishing boats in distress. Maybe the occasional drunk stumbling home from town. At 12:37 a.m., he saw the shapes. 4 men, standing in the surf line, motionless in the fog, like they'd materialized from nothing. Cullen's first thought was simple. Fishermen. It happened sometimes. Locals whose boats ran aground, needing help getting back to shore. He walked toward them, flashlight raised, ready to offer assistance. "Coast Guard," he called out. "You need help?" One of the men stepped forward, tall, mid-30s, spoke with an accent Cullen couldn't quite place. "We're fishermen from Southampton. Our boat ran aground." Cullen swept his flashlight over them. Something was wrong. Their clothes, completely dry, not damp, not even wet at the cuffs. And that accent, German? No, maybe, but the cadence was off, like someone who'd learned English somewhere else and was trying hard to sound American. "Where's your boat?" Cullen asked. The man gestured vaguely toward the water. "Out there." Cullen looked, saw nothing but fog and surf. Behind the first man, the other 3 stood perfectly still. Too still. Not like fishermen who'd just spent hours fighting the ocean, more like soldiers standing at ease. "I'll need to see some identification," Cullen said. The lead man's face changed. The friendly mask dropped. Just for a second, but Cullen saw it. "Look," the man said, voice hardening. "You don't want any trouble here." Cullen's pulse kicked up. He was alone, unarmed, 4 against 1. And whatever was happening, it wasn't fishermen in distress. The man reached into his coat. Cullen's hand tightened on his flashlight, the only thing even resembling a weapon. But the man didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out cash, a thick wad of bills. "You saw nothing here tonight," the man said. He peeled off several bills. "This is $260. Take it. Forget you saw us. Walk back to your station and file your report like usual. Nothing happened. We were never here." The bills hung between them in the fog-thick air. John Cullen was 21 years old. He made $36 a month. The money in that man's hand represented more than 7 months' salary. 7 months. But the voice offering it was wrong. The situation was wrong. Everything about these 4 men standing on a deserted American beach at midnight was catastrophically wrong. Cullen made a decision that would save lives he'd never meet. He took the money. "Okay," he said. "I didn't see anything." He backed away slowly. 5 steps. 10. The 4 men watched him go. 20 steps. 30. He kept his flashlight pointed at the ground, kept his pace steady, kept his breathing controlled, even though every instinct screamed at him to run. The moment the fog swallowed them from view, Cullen broke into a sprint. He covered the 2 miles back to the Amagansett Coast Guard station in under 15 minutes, bursting through the door, gasping, still clutching the cash. "There are men on the beach," he said. "Germans. I think they're Germans." His commanding officer, Warrant Officer Warren Barnes, looked at the money in Cullen's hand, looked at Cullen's face. "Made 1 phone call to the main station in East Hampton. Within 20 minutes, 6 armed Coast Guardsmen were on the beach. The men were gone, but they'd left something behind. As dawn broke gray and cold over Long Island, the patrol discovered what the fog had hidden: wooden crates partially buried in the sand, explosives, TNT, detonators, fuses, and, bizarrely, pieces of German military uniforms hastily discarded and half covered with sand. The enemy had landed on American soil, armed, ready, prepared for a campaign of destruction that was supposed to last 2 years, and they would have succeeded if not for a 21-year-old Coast Guardsman who'd decided that $260 wasn't worth whatever hell those 4 men were planning to unleash. 6 months earlier in Berlin, a plan that should have stayed in the fevered imagination of a bad spy novel was getting final approval from Adolf Hitler himself: Operation Pastorius, named after Franz Daniel Pastorius, the founder of the first German settlement in America. The irony was deliberate. What Germans had once built in peace, they would now destroy in war. The architect was Lieutenant Walter Kappe, a former German-American Bund member who'd spent years in the United States before returning to Germany in 1937. Kappe knew America intimately, its infrastructure, its vulnerabilities, its misplaced confidence that the war was something happening over there. His pitch to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was elegant in its simplicity. Send German agents who'd actually lived in America, who spoke fluent English with American accents, who knew how to blend in. Give them 2 years and enough explosives to cripple American war production. The target list was surgical: aluminum plants of the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, in New York, Tennessee, and Illinois, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad's key junctions, the Pennsylvania Railroad's horseshoe curve near Altoona, hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, Hell Gate Bridge in New York City, water treatment facilities in New York and Philadelphia. 2 years of sustained sabotage, factories crippled, transportation paralyzed, public morale shattered, American war production, the arsenal of democracy, brought to its knees by a handful of men with matches and dynamite. Hitler approved it personally. The plan was perfect. Except it wasn't. They recruited 8 men, 8 Germans who'd spent years in America, who'd worked ordinary jobs, who'd married American women, or joined American unions, or drunk American beer in American bars. Men who could pass. Men who could vanish into the landscape. The leader was George John Dash, 39 years old, who'd spent 19 years in the United States working as a waiter. Spoke English like a native. Knew New York like the back of his hand. Arrogant, ambitious, convinced he was smarter than everyone around him. Ernest Peter Berger, 36, had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1923. Imprisoned by the Gestapo in 1940 for making defeatist statements, he'd been released only to volunteer for this mission. Whether for redemption or revenge, no one quite knew. Heinrich Heinck, 35, machinist, 11 years in America, wife and kids in Chicago. Richard Quirin, 34, mechanic, former Bund member. Herbert Haupt, 22, born in Chicago. Returned to Germany in 1941 to visit his grandmother and found himself recruited into a war mission targeting the country of his birth. Werner Thiel, 35, machinist, Milwaukee for 20 years. American accent so perfect he could order coffee in a diner and sound like he'd grown up 3 blocks away. Edward Curling, 33, leader of the second team. Smooth, confident, former chauffeur and butler in wealthy American homes. Knew how to blend into high society or working-class neighborhoods with equal ease. Herman Neubauer, 32, cook. Worked in hotels across Connecticut and Illinois. Could talk baseball with anyone. They trained for 8 weeks at a secluded facility near Berlin. Explosives, incendiary devices, secret writing, how to recognize American military insignia. How to act like Americans, even though they were Americans, or had been, or maybe still were, depending on which part of their identity they chose to believe. They were given $175,000 in cash, nearly $3 million in today's money, forged documents, Social Security cards, draft deferment papers, everything they needed to build new lives while destroying the old country. On May 26, 1942, they boarded U-boat U-202. 4 men, Dash, Berger, Heinck, and Quirine. On May 28, the other 4 boarded U-584, Curling, Neubauer, Haupt, and Thiel. The crossing took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of diesel fumes and cramped quarters, and the constant possibility of depth charges from above. 2 weeks to think about what they were about to do. U-202 arrived first, off the coast of Long Island just after midnight on June 13th. The submarine surfaced 300 yards from shore. A rubber raft carried the 4 men and their cargo through the surf. They wore German military uniforms, a technicality meant to protect them under the Geneva Convention if captured immediately. The plan was to bury the uniforms the moment they reached shore, change into civilian clothes, and vanish into America. They were carrying enough explosives to level a city block, enough money to live for years, enough confidence to believe they were unstoppable. What they didn't carry was luck. Because John Cullen happened to be walking that particular stretch of beach at that particular moment with his flashlight and his monthly salary of $36 and his instinct that something was catastrophically wrong with 4 dry men claiming to be wet fishermen. Dash stood on the beach as Cullen's footsteps faded into the fog. He'd just paid $260 to a Coast Guard patrolman. In his mind, that was cheap insurance. The kid would take the money, file a routine report, and forget the whole thing. Who wouldn't? But something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way Cullen had looked at him. Maybe it was how quickly the kid had taken the money, too quickly, like he was buying time instead of being bought. Maybe it was just Dash's ego fracturing under the weight of how easily they'd almost been caught in the first 60 seconds of a 2-year mission. "We need to move," Berger said. "Now." They grabbed their equipment, 4 wooden crates of explosives, detonators, fuses, incendiary devices, and hauled them up the beach. Found a spot beyond the dune line, started digging, sand everywhere, wet and heavy and clinging to their hands. Behind them, U-202 had already submerged and disappeared. They were alone, on American soil, with no way back. They buried the crates, covered them poorly, and stripped off their German uniforms, tossing them in a pile and kicking sand over them like teenagers hiding beer cans. Then they changed into civilian clothes, suits, ties, hats, looking like traveling salesmen or accountants heading home from a long day. The Long Island Railroad station in Amagansett was empty at 3 a.m. They bought tickets to New York City, first train out at 6:17. They waited in the dark, smoking cigarettes, not talking, listening for sirens that never came. When the train pulled into Jamaica Station in Queens, they split up. Dash and Berger to Manhattan. Heinck and Quirine to a prearranged safe house. Dash checked into the Governor Clinton Hotel on 31st Street, room 1014. He unpacked his suitcase, laid out his forged documents, and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. He'd just landed on American soil with enough explosives to cripple war production for months. He had $82,000 in cash in his suitcase. He had 2 years to work. He had 3 partners depending on him and a second team landing in Florida any day now. And all he could think about was that Coast Guard kid running into the fog. Dash had a problem. He was smarter than everyone else, or thought he was. And smart people recognize when a plan is already failing. The plan was failing. June 14th, one day after landing, Dash picked up the phone in his hotel room and called the New York field office of the FBI. "I need to speak to J. Edgar Hoover," he said. The switchboard operator paused. "Sir, Mr. Hoover is in Washington." "Then connect me to Washington." "Who's calling?" "Franz Daniel Pastorius." He used the operation's code name. He wanted them to know this wasn't a crank call. The operator transferred him. Another voice answered. Dash explained he was a German agent who just landed on Long Island with a team of saboteurs and needed to surrender immediately. The FBI agent on the other end thought it was a prank, told Dash to call back when he was sober. Dash hung up, stared at the phone, called back. This time he got someone different, someone who listened, someone who heard the desperation and grandiosity and terror in Dash's voice and thought, this might actually be real. "Come to Washington," the agent said. "We'll meet you." Dash took the train to Washington that afternoon, checked into the Mayflower Hotel, called the FBI again from the lobby. Within an hour, 2 agents arrived. They took him to FBI headquarters, sat him down in an interrogation room, asked him to tell them everything. And Dash talked for hours. He gave them names, locations, target lists, the training facility in Germany, the U-boat designations, the second team landing in Florida, the weapons caches, the codes, the contacts. He gave them everything. Why? That's the question historians still argue about. Was Dash a genuine anti-Nazi who'd volunteered for the mission to sabotage it from the inside? Was he a coward who panicked the moment things got difficult? Was he a narcissist who wanted to be a hero and realized sabotage wouldn't make him famous, but betrayal might? Probably all 3. Probably none. Probably he was just a man who'd spent 19 years building a life in America, been recruited for a mission targeting that life, and discovered at the critical moment that he couldn't pull the trigger. Or maybe he just knew they were screwed from the moment Cullen walked away with that cash. Either way, by June 15th, 2 days after landing, the FBI knew everything. While Dash was confessing in Washington, the second team was landing in Florida. June 17th, 1:30 a.m., Ponte Vedra Beach, south of Jacksonville. U-584 surfaced 400 yards offshore. Edward Curling, Herman Neubauer, Herbert Haupt, and Werner Thiel paddled to shore in a rubber raft. No Coast Guard patrol. No fog. No interference. They buried their explosives on the beach, changed into civilian clothes, and caught a bus to Jacksonville. From there, trains to Cincinnati, Chicago, New York. They split up, made contact with old friends, family members, girlfriends, settled into safe houses and hotel rooms. They had no idea that in Washington, George Dash was giving the FBI a complete breakdown of their identities, locations, and mission objectives. Curling checked into the Hotel Gibson in Cincinnati, bought new clothes, visited a tailor, got a haircut, started planning his first target, the Horseshoe Curve on the Pennsylvania Railroad, a critical choke point for military transport between the East Coast and Midwest. Haupt, the youngest, went home to Chicago, to his parents, to his girlfriend. He'd been gone a year and told them he'd been traveling, working odd jobs, seeing the country. They believed him because why wouldn't they? What Haupt didn't know, FBI agents were already watching the house. By June 20th, 1 week after the first landing, the FBI had all 8 saboteurs under surveillance, watching, waiting, letting them incriminate themselves with every move, every purchase, every conversation. On June 22nd, the hammer dropped. FBI agents arrested Dash and Berger in New York, then Heinck, then Quiron. Same day, simultaneous raids in Chicago, Cincinnati, New York, Curling, Haupt, Thiel, Neubauer, all 8, in custody, mission over. The operation that was supposed to last 2 years ended in 9 days. J. Edgar Hoover held a press conference on June 27th, announced the arrest with the kind of chest-thumping triumphalism he'd perfected over a decade as FBI director. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, through excellent detective work, has apprehended 8 Nazi saboteurs who landed from submarines on our shores. He didn't mention John Cullen, didn't mention that the excellent detective work was actually a Coast Guard patrolman with a flashlight and a saboteur with cold feet. Hoover took credit, publicly, loudly. Behind the scenes, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was furious, not about the saboteurs, but about the legal complications. These men had technically committed acts of war on American soil. Under normal circumstances, they'd be tried in civilian courts with all the constitutional protections that entailed: right to counsel, public trial, jury of peers, appeals process that could take years. Roosevelt didn't want years. He wanted swift justice. He wanted a message sent to Berlin that American soil was impenetrable. On July 2, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Proclamation 2561, establishing a military tribunal to try the 8 saboteurs for violations of the laws of war. No jury, no appeals to civilian courts, no publicity. The trial began July 8th in the Department of Justice building, room 5235. Closed to the public, closed to the press. 7 generals presided. The prosecution had 2 weeks of testimony, documents, physical evidence, and, most damningly, Dash's complete confession. The defense argued that the men had never actually committed sabotage. They'd landed, yes. Carried explosives, yes. But they'd been arrested before causing any damage. Intent wasn't execution. Planning wasn't action. The tribunal didn't care. The law of war was clear. Entering the United States covertly during wartime while wearing or carrying enemy uniforms with the intent to commit sabotage was sufficient for prosecution. All 8 were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death. Then came the complications. Dash had surrendered voluntarily. Berger had cooperated extensively. Without them, the FBI might never have caught the other 6 in time. What do you do with traitors to their own mission? Roosevelt commuted Dash's sentence to 30 years. Berger got life. The other 6, Heinck, Quirin, Curling, Thiel, Haupt, and Neubauer, were scheduled for execution on August 8, 1942. The electric chair at the District of Columbia Jail was designed for 1 person at a time. On August 8th, it would be used 6 times in 3 hours. Herbert Haupt was 22 years old, born in Chicago. Spoke English better than German, had spent the last 3 weeks in a cell thinking about his girlfriend, his parents, the life he'd thrown away for a mission he'd never even wanted. They came for him first. 12:02 p.m., 2 guards, a chaplain, down the corridor, through the door, into the execution chamber. The chair was oak, worn leather straps, electrodes, a metal cap, the smell of antiseptic and something else underneath, burnt flesh from previous executions, impossible to completely clean away. They strapped him in, arms, legs, chest, positioned the cap, wetted the sponge contacts for better conductivity. Haupt said nothing, no final words. Just stared straight ahead at the witnesses, FBI agents, military officers, a representative from the State Department. The executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts for 1 minute. Haupt's body went rigid. The lights dimmed. The air filled with the smell of burning hair and skin. A doctor checked for a pulse, pronounced him dead at 12:05 p.m. They carried the body out through the side door, reset the chair, brought in the next man, Heinrich Heinck, Ernest Quirin, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, one after another, 3 hours, 6 men dead. Hitler's grand plan to sabotage American industry ended in an oak chair in a Washington, D.C. jail while the summer sun blazed outside and the city went about its Saturday afternoon oblivious to what was happening 3 floors underground. In Berlin, when news of the executions finally reached the Abwehr, there was silence, then fury, then accusations. Who'd betrayed them? Who'd talked? How had the FBI known where to find every single saboteur within days of landing? They suspected American intelligence had cracked their codes, or that one of the U-boat crews had been compromised, or that there was a high-level mole in Berlin feeding information to Washington. They never suspected the truth, that their hand-picked team leader had simply picked up a phone and confessed. German military intelligence spent months investigating. They interrogated U-boat crews. They reviewed communications. They looked for patterns, breaks in protocol, security breaches. They never found anything because there was nothing to find except one man's decision that surrender was smarter than sabotage. Walter Kappa, the operations architect, went quiet, disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the collapsing Third Reich, vanished at the end of the war, either killed, imprisoned, or successfully blending into civilian life under a new identity. No one knows. J. Edgar Hoover, meanwhile, became a national hero. The press ate it up. Master detective thwarts Nazi plot through brilliant investigative work. Hoover gave interviews, wrote articles, burnished his legend. John Cullen got a commendation, a ceremony at Coast Guard headquarters, a handshake, a certificate, then back to patrol duty. He didn't speak publicly about that night for nearly 30 years. When he finally did, in the 1970s, he described it simply, "I was scared out of my mind. I took the money because I figured it was the only way I'd get out of there alive. Then I ran." No heroics, no grand declarations. Just a 21-year-old doing his job and trusting his instincts when everything told him something was wrong. Dash and Berger were released from prison in 1948 and deported to Germany. Dash spent the rest of his life, another 35 years, insisting he'd been a hero, a double agent working against the Nazis from the beginning, a man who'd sacrificed everything to save American lives. Maybe he was. Maybe he was just a saboteur with cold feet who wanted credit for the betrayal. History remembers him as both, or neither, or something in between. After the war, when Allied interrogators sat down with captured German generals and intelligence officers, they asked about Operation Pastorius. They wanted to know what went wrong. How did such a carefully planned operation collapse so completely? The Germans couldn't answer. They'd spent years analyzing it. The mission design was solid, the training rigorous, the selection process careful. The men were competent, experienced, motivated, and yet, total failure within 9 days. When interrogators finally explained what had actually happened, a chance encounter with a Coast Guard patrolman, a spontaneous bribe, a phone call to the FBI, the German officers were stunned. General Lieutenant Erwin von Lahausen, who'd overseen Abwehr sabotage operations. A Coast Guard? A boy with a flashlight? That's what destroyed the entire operation? The interrogator nodded. Lahausen laughed. A bitter, exhausted laugh. "We lost because of a boy with a flashlight." It wasn't entirely true. The operation was doomed for other reasons. Dash's unreliability, the amateurish execution, the FBI's increasing sophistication. But the triggering event, the thing that turned a difficult mission into an impossible one, was John Cullen walking a beach at the exact wrong or right moment and making the decision not to take $260 at face value. War is like that. Grand strategies collapse because of small moments. Years of planning unravel in 60 seconds. The difference between success and catastrophic failure is sometimes just one person's instinct that something doesn't feel right. Operation Pastorius failed, but the impulse behind it never died. The idea that you could infiltrate enemy territory with a handful of trained operatives and cripple infrastructure through targeted sabotage, that idea lived on. After Pastorius, Germany tried other approaches: sleeper agents in South America, sympathizers in neutral countries, propaganda campaigns designed to erode American morale from within. None of them worked, because the fundamental assumption was wrong, that America was vulnerable to this kind of attack, that Americans were naive or complacent or too comfortable to notice enemy infiltration. What Pastorius proved was the opposite, that a 21-year-old making $36 a month would choose duty over a 7-month salary, that he'd trust his instincts even when outnumbered and unarmed, that the vast surveillance and intelligence apparatus everyone feared wasn't necessary when ordinary people simply paid attention. The German generals were stunned not because the operation failed, military operations fail all the time, but because it failed for such an ordinary reason. No brilliant detective work, no sophisticated cryptanalysis, no dramatic shootout. Just a kid with a flashlight who knew something was wrong and acted on it. That was the lesson they never learned, that the strength of a society at war isn't found in its intelligence agencies or military might or industrial capacity, though all those matter. It's found in the millions of ordinary people who, when confronted with a choice between right and convenient, choose right, even when right is terrifying, even when convenient comes with $260 in cash, especially then. John Cullen lived until 2011, 89 years old. He gave occasional interviews in his later years, but mostly stayed quiet about that night. When pressed, he'd say the same thing: "I was just doing my job." But that's not quite true. His job was to patrol the beach and report anomalies, taking a bribe from suspicious men and then reporting them anyway. That wasn't in the manual. That was improvisation under pressure. That was choosing to play along just long enough to get away. That was intelligent courage, which is rarer than the reckless kind. The beach at Amagansett looks different now. Expensive homes, summer tourists, no more Coast Guard patrols. The sand where Cullen stood that night has been washed away and replaced 1,000 times over by tides and storms. But the fog still comes in thick on June nights, and if you walk that beach alone after midnight with nothing but a flashlight, you can almost feel it. The weight of that moment when 4 men emerged from the darkness and 1 kid had to decide in seconds whether to be bought or to run. He ran, and an empire's plan to sabotage America died in the fog because of it. That's the story German generals couldn't believe when they heard it. That's the story J. Edgar Hoover tried to claim credit for. That's the story that proves wars aren't won just by armies and admirals, but by 21-year-olds with flashlights who trust their gut when everything tells them something is catastrophically wrong. Sometimes history turns on grand battles and strategic brilliance. And sometimes it turns on a bribe refused, a sprint through fog, and a phone call that changed everything. June 13th, 1942. Amagansett Beach, 12:37 a.m. 1 kid, 1 flashlight, 1 decision. That's how Hitler's master plan died before it even began.